The Humanist Codex, podcast number 5, the 5-minute series on formal logic, episode number 1. Introduction to formal logic. So, let's start off with a question. What is formal logic? A lot of people think of logic as a concept, something abstract, something not well defined, something like love, for example. Sometimes they'll think about Spock on Star Trek, and they'll think that logic is simply the absence of emotion, reasoning without letting your emotional state interfere. Well, none of these could really be further from the truth. Formal logic isn't any more abstract than engineering. It's a well-understood process, as well as a set of established rules for determining how we can deduce new conclusions from information that we already have. Now, you may ask yourself, why do we need a process for determining what is true and what isn't? Well, it turns out our brains aren't very good at making smart decisions or even acquiring information very accurately. We evolved to survive in pre-industrial societies, not the information age. Our senses bombard us with far more information than our brains could ever process. So our brains make rapid decisions about what's relevant and what isn't, and makes these decisions based on a whole bunch of assumptions, many of which often aren't actually true. And while this speeds up our ability to process information, it does so at the cost of accuracy. Now, again, you might say, I don't see any evidence of this. My mind works perfectly well. But unless you've actually taken the time to compare your reasoning process to a more formal system like logic, there's no way for you to know what deficits you may or may not have in your reasoning ability. It reminds me of an old joke about the fisherman on the lake. He's there in his skiff and he's breaking out his rod and reel, and he sees two fish swimming alongside him. He turns to the fish and says, "How's the water, boys?" The fish are puzzled, and one turns to the other and says, "What's water?" Now, we have on the Codex all sorts of puzzles and brain teasers to show just how much your brain actually does not process reality properly. Ask any cop about eyewitness testimony, and they'll tell you it's notoriously unreliable. If you have a bank robbery and there are 10 witnesses, you'll get 14 different accounts of what the robber looked like. There was, just a couple years ago, that huge mix-up over the color of a dress worn by a Hollywood actress. Half the people who looked at the dress thought it was blue and black, and the other half thought it was gold and white. This is the same dress, in fact the same image of that dress, and people couldn't agree as to what color the dress was. In fact, it wasn't even until they contacted the manufacturer that the debate was finally settled. When you take a look at all the kinds of evidence we have today, video, audio recordings, DNA, carbon dating, fossilized remains, you realize that eyewitness testimony is actually about the worst form of evidence there is. We're fallible, our memories change over time, and we're not always completely honest. But other forms of evidence aren't subject to our own frailties and biases. The interpretation of this evidence, of course, is subject to our biases, but that's an issue for another time. Another problem of knowledge, and with coming to an understanding of whether or not something is true, is epistemological. Now, epistemology is the field of philosophy which deals with truth. What is true? Is there such a thing as truth? Is truth relative, or can one reach an objective truth? After thousands of years of epistemology, about the best we've been able to come up with is that nobody can know that any one thing is in fact true. Heck, I can't even prove that I exist and that I'm here. I mean, maybe I'm a brain in a tank somewhere. Maybe we're all living in the Matrix. So you can't say anything is certain. What we do have, however, are degrees of certainty. It can be said that some things are more likely to be true than others. The brilliance of science is that it embraces this limitation. The scientific method invites the challenging of established ideas. In fact, science is so successful, we've accomplished more in the last 350 years than in the 10,000 years before that. It is literally mankind's single most successful endeavor, letting us heat our homes, cure disease, and even letting us land a man on the moon, and probably just as importantly, get him back alive. Now, science and formal logic are inexorably interwoven. Both are processes and sets of rules which, while sometimes dreadfully inconvenient, nonetheless have a long, long history of eventually getting us to the correct result. So logic, in the formal sense, is both a process, a way of thinking, and a set of rules which are designed to keep us from the pitfalls of our own internal biases and assumptions. Now, I think our educational system is woefully inadequate in this regard. All students should be required to take a logic class, but absent a few logic problems and standardized testing, we don't really cover it. In this series, we're going to talk about some of the rules of logic, common fallacies that people make, and how to refute logical arguments. We hope that you enjoy this series, and forgive us if we're not always exactly on the 5-minute mark, and that you find this series fun and informative nonetheless. Thank you for your time.